Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of today here on the show, I do want to remind you yet again that if you wish to contribute and interact with the show more directly while we are streaming, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube yet again. Great way to contribute and interact with the show. It's greatly appreciated for all you do, but without further ado, let's jump right into our second segment of the day and go over some exciting performances from the week in the NFL. Now, the challenge in trying to keep this Fantasy Stars list fresh is because we're getting to that point in the season where, as always, we kind of know who's who at this point. And we kind of go through different positions and say, okay, we can predict who we believe can star for certain teams in certain situations week in, week out. However, there have been a lot of performances in recent weeks that warrant whether or not they were the best at their positions inclusion on my list. And I want that to be the emphasis for these lists going forward, showing the depth of the National Football League at each and every single position that matters in fantasy to present to you. Because now we're in the portion of the fantasy season where everything's going to kind of feel rushed, and you're going to want to start making decisions about the fantasy playoffs, whether you're in the middle of the pack and trying to make a push, or you're trying to prepare for a deeper run within them. So, look for my Fantasy Stars list to still include some players who you expect to see here. But I also want to acknowledge and give the flowers to the players who have truly been unsung heroes and hidden gems in the fantasy landscape this season. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Starting off at the quarterback position, not necessarily a fantasy star who you would expect to see week in, week out, but someone who's had a pretty consistent season nevertheless. And ultimately, we can't ignore, even if it's against one of the worst teams in the National Football League, putting up 52 points and throwing for over 400 yards, because that's just incredible in the landscape of the NFL and against a defense who, mind you, has been playing teams close that you feel should have beaten them in those games by a much larger margin. So, taking care of business in a potential trap game where they could have been dragged into the Jacksonville Jaguars side of the play, Jared Goff rose above and beyond in this one. 24 for 29. 412 yards, 4 touchdowns, 34.58 fantasy points. And look, if it weren't for those 5 interceptions last week against the Texans, this would be my MVP frontrunner. Because in this offense, right, they've built it so that no one player is superior to the other. And Jared Goff is the right quarterback for that style of play. He's not someone who's selfishly going to force things downfield. He's not someone who is going to be playing hero ball week in, week out either. He's just an efficient player at the quarterback position who can get the job done for this offense and its versatility. He can allow Dave Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs to carry the run game and let that be the focal point of the offense any given week. Or you can distribute it to some of the most versatile complementary weapons in the National Football League with Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jameson Williams, Sam Laporta when he's healthy, and what have you. That just goes to show that even though Jared Goff was never really appealing as a fantasy prospect in the first place, he still is someone that has now found a home where he is respected and lauded for his style of play. And if it warrants big numbers week in, week out, then his reputation is only going to grow further. And a lot more people are going to grow privy to him as an actual starter in their fantasy roster week in, week out. Because I think with the Rams, they kind of got caught up in someone who is going to be more of a game manager in that McVay system. But now that he's with the Lions and seeing as to how he's a huge reason as to why they're such a consistent football team, you have to respect who he is. And that's why I feel like even though, this season it can be justified that he can be seen as a fantasy star, he still, in my opinion, is someone who kind of goes under the radar just because of how good his team is. But now I think he should deserve his flowers on my NFL Week 11 Fantasy Stars list. Now let's get a little bit weird and wacky here, because this guy comes out once a year, maybe once every 2 years, and has a fantasy performance that has our jaws on the floor. You know exactly who I'm talking about. It's everyone's favorite New Orleans Saints Swiss Army knife, Taysom Hill here. One of the most incredible stat lines in NFL history. 7 carries, 138 yards, 3 touchdowns, 8 catches for 50 yards, 1 for 2 through the air for 18 yards, and he threw in a fumble return and interception as well as kind of a dessert for us. A truly captivating fantasy performance to the grand total of 41.52 fantasy points. Now, I'm not saying that week in, week out, Taysom Hill is going to be in your fantasy roster, because while he is one of the most versatile weapons in NFL history, he is not going to have 40 burgers in fantasy week in, week out. We've seen that. He's seen as a utility guy for this New Orleans Saints roster. But I just have to acknowledge how fun it is that we get to experience a player like Taysom Hill, no matter the circumstances, in this Saints offense. It's just special to watch. And not for nothing, if the Saints really believe in the Darren Rizzi effect, the NFC South, I feel like, is more wide open than ever. Yes, the Falcons have a lot of tiebreakers, but the Saints now have won 2. The Bucs are going to get Mike Evans back. This division is going to get a lot of fun. And maybe Taysom Hill can be a part of that, because he certainly is, when he's on the football field, one of the most fun players to watch and monitor in fantasy ever, because he's just that special of a player. No one can have a stat line like that in the NFL. I think it's the first stat line in many years, maybe since stats were first being recorded in the NFL. So that's why I have to acknowledge it when it happens, because we're never going to see these kind of performances ever again from a player of Taysom Hill's kind of magnitude. And that's why, fantasy is so special, because the bizarre can happen week in, week out, and you may benefit from it, and it may be to your detriment. So, whether or not Taysom Hill is of any importance to you in fantasy, he still has to be accounted for because of how special he can be. So I had to include him on this list. Now let's get a little bit weirder and wackier. Some unsung heroes of the week, some hidden gems you might be looking at on the waiver wire. I'll be talking a little bit about these guys as well tomorrow. But how about, and I could have really picked any receiver in the National Football League, whether it be continuing with the Lions trend of Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jameson Williams having big games, Puka Nacua showing up against the Patriots. How about Nick Westbrook-Ikhine? This is a guy on a Titans team that's playing out the season who has proven that he can be a dynamic player in that weird Titans receiving situation. Remember, DeAndre Hopkins is no longer there, and I feel like Calvin Ridley's starting to grow very frustrated with this organization. But that leaves space for a guy like Westbrook-Ikhine to really elevate his game. And he only had 2 receptions in this game, but one of them was the longest touchdown in the NFL in 2 years. So 2 receptions, 117 yards, including a 98-yard touchdown. 19.7 fantasy points from him. And yeah, while a lot of people were thinking, well, fantasy stars could connote superstars, and Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jameson Williams had a lot more points, and maybe even Puka Nacua did as well. But Nick Westbrook-Ikhine is warranting consideration for the long run for this season in fantasy, because of what he could mean as a breakout star for your fantasy roster. He could be someone who could really bolster your squad, or someone who can actually help you get into the playoffs. As we get a comment from Lil Fettuccini 68, what a name, welcome to the chat. He actually gives me a boxing question here. When will Jake Paul fight a real boxer again? Unfortunately, I think you're at the wrong show, but I will answer this question. I'm not a huge boxing fan, my man, but I'm glad that you gave me this question and gave me a good laugh. I don't think he'll ever fight a real boxer again, because of the fact, he kind of is doing this for the publicity. But thank you for the question, my man, even though it's a fantasy sports show, getting a good laugh out of me, and I will address it, Any comment is a good one here on the show. But, I hope that, if he wants this to be a career, he actually will find someone, but this is mainly a publicity stunt for him. Let's be real. It's not necessarily, something that could be a solid career if he continues to do it, but it just goes to show that sometimes, these guys come in and respect the game and want to box guys like Tyson, but did he really have to do it in this moment in time in Tyson's life where he might have wanted to move on? So it's an interesting question, even though, it is a fantasy show. Again, any comment's a good comment. Welcome to the chat, my man. But getting back into my NFL fantasy stars of the week, unfortunately, Jake Paul is not a fantasy star in the NFL, but, Our final one is going to be someone who, as Little Fettuccini 68, has another question. Continue them coming, my man. Did the Seahawks do enough yesterday to actually make a good playoff run? Well, it seems too soon to say, but they're right back in the thick of the NFC West. I do think that this could be a statement of intent game for them, a get-right game, because they go in next week against the Cardinals at home. If they win that, look where they are. They're first place in the NFC West. So I do think that in terms of the flow of the game, I like what our defense did, but I do think this offense does need to step up. If they find themselves in situations like that 4th and 1 late in the game when they were trying to drive in the field and win, I feel like they need more variance and creativity in those moments, but I do feel like this offense is complementary enough and can score on anyone, really, that this team can be a threat to make a playoff run. So thank you for this question, my man. But our final player that I want to get to before we head to break is Jonnu Smith. Who would have thought that a Dolphins tight end in this era of their run, not like a sicky head we've seen, it was this really good run by a Dolphins tight end. 6 receptions, 101 yards, 2 touchdowns, 28.1 fantasy points for him. And it's kind of funny that it's him and not a guy like Tyreek Hill or Jalen Waddle leading the way for this kind of Dolphins run. But I do feel like they need someone to stretch the middle of the field to kind of open up what Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle can do on the outside and in short to intermediate out and areas of the field. But Jonnu Smith is still someone who I feel like could be an interesting hidden gem from a fantasy perspective, because of his meaning to this team. So I had to include him here as my final Week 11 fantasy star player in the NFL. But coming up after this short break, we're going to take a look at some college football fantasy stars. Another great week of performances there as well. We'll be right back after this short break, just like I said.